A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support. Last month, a storm bore down on our small town, thick clouds roiling in a way that felt almost foreboding. It felt like that storm had crept right into my neighbor Lisa's home, too, when she staggered over to my porch, eyes wide and disheveled, clutching her phone like it was a hot coal. "I think I need to go to the hospital," she gasped, her voice a mix of desperation and fear, but it wasn't the words that sent a shiver down my spine, it was the way she said it, as though she was trying so hard to keep it together but knowing her grip on reality was slipping. I could see her young son, Thomas, peeking from behind the screen door, those big, innocent eyes wide with confusion, and suddenly that shiver transforming into a full-blown shudder as I imagined how scared he must be at that moment. What had started as a simple rainstorm turned into an unbearable weight swirling in my stomach. I hadn't had the best relationship with Lisa, she rarely reached out unless she needed something, and here she was, practically demanding I take care of Thomas just so she could feel free enough to leave. The storm rumbled ominously overhead, and I didn't want to find myself plunged into the chaos of her life, so I hesitated for a heartbeat too long before saying, but frankly, I couldn't even finish that one pathetic little word before she started begging, "Please, I've tried calling a babysitter, but they're all busy. I can't leave him. Not now." I could see that desperation and fear were mixing into a cocktail of urgency, and my insides twisted as I imagined the looming hospital visit, thoughts racing through my mind about what it might reveal. What if something terrible was going on? What if I said yes and it spiraled downward? I shook my head, feeling my resolve harden despite the fluttering anxiety in my chest. I told her, "I'm really sorry, Lisa, but I can't. I have plans." It wasn't a lie, my nerves had been frayed by last week's sleepless nights and the dreadful anxiety that came with the unknown. There was something inside me that whispered she'd find someone else, and while I pressed my lips together to silence it, it only amplified in the silence. Her face fell, anger momentarily flashing in those wild eyes before they pooled with tears, and just then as the wind picked up, a small rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, resonating the storm's resonance with her heartbreak. "You're a monster," she hissed, and although I sucked in a breath, ready to explain how I wasn't prepared for her chaos, the moment just shattered. "All I'm asking is for a few hours," she continued, her voice trembling. "What would you do in my place?" I realized this was no longer about me or my panic. I had to find what was beneath my refusal, what was the cost now that I had said it out loud. I could feel guilt creeping into the corners of my heart, coupling with my relentless anxiety. I had just locked myself out of something elemental. She twisted away from me, storm clouds roiling in her eyes as she retreated, that small hand of her son reaching for her, this sweet boy who didn't understand anything beyond a child's innocence. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have done more, that I would pay for my refusal. And just as I started to make amends with myself, an ominous message flashed on my phone very late one night. A simple text read, "Lisa was found." I felt an oppressive weight in my chest, burying me in doubt. The words "found" could mean anything, yet they stood stark against the solitude of night, intensifying my fear. I didn't even know how to process that, who to reach out to, or what else I might have caused when I had chosen my own comfort over that child in desperate need, the seed of anxiety sprouting into a relentless vine strangling my thoughts. I lost sleep, switched off my phone, and tried to quiet my mind as new pangs of remorse twisted inside. Until finally, the storm decision echoed back, shattering my solitude as I found the resolve to confront my cowardice. I trudged over to her house, the sky heavy with moisture, wind whipping at my clothes. I brought with me just a small bouquet I had cobbled together from my backyard. Upon reaching her home, though, dread built up the moment I caught sight of flashing lights against the windows, the police, their rigid figures silhouetted against the open door, spelling tragedy. A knot in my stomach deepened. I had worse fears about what had happened than I could admit. I stood rooted as I overheard snippets of a conversation. She was in some kind of state. "We'll get him out to safety," and in a shadowed corner of my mind, something thudded sickeningly as the implications crashed over me. I had known. I had known when I felt that chill in my gut, the heaviness of something grotesque awakening after I refused. Then, a small, familiar silhouette collided with my view. Thomas, hair tousled, eyes blurred with tears as he was led away, crying for his mother while the officers inspected his sad little figure. I could see the raw confusion wrapped around his expression like a shroud. I opened my mouth, but nothing emerged, my heart hammering in my chest as it dawned on me. She hadn't gone to the hospital because she needed to, she had been in an irreversible descent that I had just turned my back on, and that refusal now manifested a darkness I never anticipated, a helpless child standing dumbstruck in a storm of his own, and I froze under all the weight of it. The cries of a frightened boy saturated the evening air, buried deeper into a grisly storm of fate that had been intertwined with my choice, suffocating all rationality. A figure emerged, covering Thomas with a blanket, but all I could see were the words echoing back, reverberating inside me relentlessly, "AITA for refusing to look after a child." And in that haunting moment, as I stood paralyzed among the onlookers, I knew the answer clawing at my insides like an uncontained beast, leaving me ash-gray with dread as I began to understand. It was a fight I had already lost. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation that blurred the lines between right and wrong, but as I stood outside the theater, the vibrant energy of the evening dulled by a series of increasingly impatient glances, I wondered if I had crossed an invisible boundary. I was there to see Wicked, a show I'd been looking forward to for months, and as the line wrapped around the building under the bright streetlights, anticipation thickened in the air. My phone buzzed incessantly with eager messages from friends eager to meet after the show, but I was determined to shut it out and soak up the excitement. That's when I saw her, a woman, mid-30s, vibrant red hair cascading over her shoulders, standing right in front of me, engrossed in an animated phone conversation that seemed all too important to her. I tried to ignore the growing annoyance in my chest and drowned out her loud laughter, but every witty retort and self-indulgent chuckle felt like a dagger driving deeper into the heart of my evening. I mean, come on. Some of us were here to enjoy an extraordinary performance, not to witness private conversations at full volume. As the minutes ticked down to the start time, my irritation boiled over. "Excuse me." I mustered the courage to call out, the sound of my voice slicing through the buzz of excited chatter. She turned, her surprised eyes locking onto mine with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Can you please be a little quieter? Some of us actually want to enjoy the pre-show." The words rushed out like bile. A ripple of silence fell over the line, all eyes now glued to us. I could feel the weight of judgment in the air. What was supposed to be a brief moment of assertive clarity had turned into a live performance for the waiting crowd. Instead of shrinking back like I expected, she exploded. "Aren't you just the biggest little snob?" Her voice heightened, dripping with sarcasm. She held the phone in one hand, brandishing it like a sword, and her laughter abruptly transformed into a high-pitched giggle as if she were mocking me. Maybe if some of us weren't so uptight, we'd get to enjoy the show a bit more. Ever think of that? Each word hit hard, like stones thrown in anger, igniting a ripple of laughter behind her as her friends rallied around the charge. My fists clenched at my sides, the blood pounding in my ears so loudly I could barely hear my thoughts. I could see other theatergoers carving out their opinion in the way they looked at me, a mix of sympathy and disapproval. It was then that a realization struck, a crack in my composure. Maybe I was being unreasonable, but that didn't stop my temper from flaring, and before I knew it, I yelled back, "Maybe you don't need to share every detail of your miserable life with the world. Ever think some of us are here to escape it?" The gasp from the crowd was palpable, like a sudden intake of breath before an intense scene. The woman's face twisted in disbelief, her laughter abruptly cut off, leaving a painful silence hanging in the chilly night air. An angry flush crept up my neck, and just when I thought the moment might pass, she stepped closer, her eyes narrowed and her voice dropping to a whisper, bitter and low. "You think this is a show for you to escape to? You've only scratched the surface of what life can throw at you, and let me tell you, and I know you won't believe me, this is nothing compared to real pain." I felt something twist in my gut at the challenge in her gaze, a feeling that there was more at play than just a rude theatergoer. Each heartbeat echoed with my growing unease, and the crowd around us felt like they were holding their breath, waiting for a resolution to this absurdity that had taken on a life of its own. She was right, in a way. How could I know what monsters lurked in her reality? But as the theater doors swung open, spilling warm light and murmurs of music out into the cool night air, I realized I didn't care. I was tired, too tired, of dealing with selfish people in a world that oftentimes felt far too chaotic. Without thinking, I waved her off dismissively, my voice laced with frustration. "Whatever. Enjoy your unnecessary phone call." That must have struck a nerve, because she glanced back at me for a split second before rejoining her group of friends, and just as quickly as the confrontation had begun, it fizzled. I was left there, feeling the weight of my anger linger, tangled with something more profound, an unsettling sense of dread. The show started, and I tried to immerse myself in the enchantment of emerald green costumes and soaring melodies, but her laughter still rang in my ears, creating a friction in my mind I couldn't shake. What if she's right? My own thoughts haunted me like phantoms as I watched the story unfold on stage, the vibrant colors slipping by but never fully capturing my attention. Images of her piercing green eyes, that moment of shared rage, replayed in my mind. Who was I to judge anyone's choices, especially when my own life felt tangled and unpredictable? Then something shifted. I noticed she was sitting 2 rows down from me as the act wore on, and to my dismay, they were still laughing, still talking, this time at a whisper, but clearly still engaged with their phones, still distracting in ways that made me grit my teeth. The frustration boiled over again until I could stand it no longer. I stood up, heart pounding, and hissed, "Can you please just put your phones away and watch the show?" The words felt like fire leaping from my throat, but all they earned me was a triumphant glance from the woman. It was as if she was waiting for this, even expecting me to lash out again, and that was when I knew it was no longer about her phone call, it was an insidious dance of power and pride, and I was entrapped. She casually leaned back, smirk lacing her features. "You really think making this a bigger spectacle makes you some kind of hero?" She shot back, laughter bubbling from her lips, buoyed by the cheers of her friends. My blood turned to ice, and it dawned on me, I was being played. Her deliberate entrapment had turned the heat of my anger into a fiery embarrassment. Just as I recoiled, I felt a deep pull of anxiety fill the recesses of my mind, like an extreme panic gnawing at me, and I sank back into my seat, overwhelmed. I was now the unwitting star of a show I didn't intend to be in, and all I wanted was to disappear. After the final curtain call, I stumbled out onto the streets, a numbing shame seeping into my bones. I was both the villain and the fool, caught in a careless confrontation that had turned the joyous night sour. But as I walked away, I couldn't quite shake the sense that this experience had changed something within me. It was no longer just about her phone call, it was a mirror reflecting my own failings and a story that continued on without me, left to fester on the streets as I disappeared into the night. Was I the asshole for yelling? Maybe. But the truth stung brighter than any shame, honesty splintered in a way I hadn't expected. My life was messy, and sometimes boundaries need to be drawn, even at the cost of losing sight of the enchantment a show could bring. So maybe, just maybe, the real question was, could I forgive myself for demanding silence in a world filled with chaos, or chalk it all up to an unhappy accident never to be resolved? AITA for not inviting my nephew on vacation? It started as a simple family trip to a cabin in the woods, a chance for my kids to unwind before school started again, but everything changed when my sister's son, Jamie, was mentioned. I hadn't seen him in a while. His mother, Sarah, had become reclusive since her divorce, her walls tightening around her like a fortress. The last time we were together, Jamie was a sweet, albeit awkward, 12-year-old. You'd think his 16th birthday would have matured him, but he felt different somehow, more distant and brooding. Sarah texted me a week before we left, pleading me to take him. "He needs family," she wrote, her words laced with desperation. I hesitated. Jamie had started to linger around the edges of social media, posting pictures that hinted at a fascination with dark themes, and I've always been the protective type, especially when it concerns my kids. Just days before the trip, I finally responded, "He can stay with you, we're looking for a low-key vacation." I thought that would be the end of it. But on the day we left, I caught my sister's expression when she saw my kids loaded into the car, a mix of hope and dread that twisted something inside me. They waved goodbye, and Jamie's eyes, oh God, those eyes, held such a haunting intensity, a storm of emotions boiling just beneath the surface. I could barely sleep in the cabin, the walls creaked unnervingly at night, and I kept hearing whispers, low and slithering like a snake through the air, but I tried to shake it off, just the house settling, I told myself. On the second evening, while the kids roasted marshmallows outside, I found an old scrapbook tucked beneath one of the beds in our room. The pages were yellowed and curling, filled with grainy photographs of children. I flipped through and my stomach dropped at the sight. Jamie was in some of them, looking eerily out of place, and the other kids, they looked off, like something dark was seeping from their smiles, their eyes too hollow. My headache worsened, shadows seemed to twist into figures in the periphery, and I could have sworn I heard breathing whenever I turned my back. I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah had known something before she packed Jamie off. That night, my children were restless, they tossed and turned, sleep eluding them, and at one point, my youngest, Lily, woke me up, wide-eyed and terrified, whispering of a man in the woods who stared at her from behind the trees. I brushed it off, thinking it was just an imagination lit by the flickering firelight, but I couldn't help but feel an ominous presence lurking beyond our campfire. The following day, I decided to take a hike with the kids to dispel the uneasy feeling hanging over us. As we wandered deeper into the woods, I noticed a tree carved with strange symbols, things that twisted my stomach and made my heart race, symbols that hinted at something ritualistic, dark. Lily, transfixed, wanted to touch the bark, but I pulled her away just in time, the feeling of dread coiling tighter around my mind. That evening, the message came through. Sarah was frantic, texting me nonstop, telling me Jamie had gone missing. My heart dropped, panic crashing over me. I quickly attempted to reassure her. Of course we hadn't invited him to the trip, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was more involved in the panic than I realized. Something whispered that we were wrong to leave him behind. The next few days blurred, another night passed, and I heard scratching at the walls, voices calling to me and childlike laughter, and when I stepped outside, I was hit by an unbearable chill. The woods felt alive, breathing, twisting in ways nature shouldn't, a cacophony of whispers beckoning me, saying come play with us. On the fourth day, the atmosphere shifted entirely. My kids began acting differently, more aggressive, thick-lipped smiles stretching beyond the realm of normalcy, their eyes bearing an unnatural light that chilled my spine. "Where's Jamie?" they asked over and over, speaking of him as if he had always been with them. I felt sweat pooling at the base of my neck. I tried to wrangle them away from the shadows that seemed to creep closer with each passing hour, and finally, I gathered the courage to venture deeper into the forest alone, driven by an instinct to find Jamie. As I stepped through the trees, whispers became a chorus, begging me to stay, luring me deeper until I stumbled upon a clearing. There, in the center, was a figure dressed in dark clothes, a silhouette of Jamie, but he looked older, almost feral, eyes shrouded in shadow, the edge of his smile vivid against hollow cheeks. My breath hitched as he turned, revealing teeth sharp as knives and an unnatural grin far too wide for his face. "I've been waiting for you," he hissed, his voice crawling beneath my skin, splintering the quiet like thunder. The shadows danced around him, and as they flickered, I felt a wrenching pull inside of me, and as if the woods had conspired, my kids burst into the clearing, eyes glowing, voices harmonizing with Jamie's as they called me to join them. Then came the sound, like a collective heartbeat, an echo of every kid that ever disappeared in those woods. I turned to run, but the shadows wrapped around my legs, their laughter curling around me, pulling me into their realm. And just as I felt myself slipping into the abyss, a sudden thought shattered through the haze: AITA for not inviting my nephew on vacation. As that realization hit, this strange bond washed over me. I knew that in denying his invited presence, I had awakened something that should have remained dormant. I stumbled back, gasping, pushing against the tangible dark that swirled around me until I finally broke free, tumbling back toward the safety of our cabin, heart racing, mind screaming. I shut the door, locking it tight, a desperate barricade against the voices. I ordered my children to get their things. We were leaving. I didn't care what they thought. I glanced back at the woods, Jamie standing at the edge, a devilish allure flickering in his darkened figure, and as we drove away, I couldn't help but feel his gaze burning into my back, burning with the knowledge that every year my sister kept him from us, every vacation we had without him, every time we let the shadows whisper, I was sealing not just my fate, but his legacy, a legacy rising from the depths of the forest where children disappear without a trace, where families fall captive, and in that darkness, a voice would always echo, a question reverberating in the silence. AITA for not inviting my nephew on vacation. Every year during summer break, my family and I head to our favorite lakeside cabin, a place marked by its tranquility and untouched beauty. It's always been a retreat from the chaos of life, but this last trip took a turn that still keeps me up at night. We arrived late on a Friday, just as a thunderstorm began to roll in, dark clouds brewing ominously over the mountains. My parents settled, and while I grabbed my backpack and headed to the rickety old pier, hoping to catch a moment of calm before the storm hit. As I stood staring out at the choppy water, I felt a presence beside me. I turned to see a girl, maybe a year or two younger than me, her auburn hair drenched by the rain, and her eyes wide as if she had somehow slipped into a different reality. Without a word, she motioned for me to follow her down the pier. Intrigued but slightly uneasy, I obeyed, as if bound by some invisible thread. She walked with a purpose until we reached the end, where the distance from land felt surreal, as if we were standing on the edge of the world. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Just then, the sky split with a blinding flash of lightning, and I jumped, splashing into the murky water below. The last thing I remember was the girl's scream as I felt the cold envelop me, sinking deeper until everything went black. When I came to, I was gasping for air, my chest heaving as I clawed my way back to the surface. I looked around frantically for the girl, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. I pulled myself onto the pier, soaked and terrified, but a part of me felt something I can only describe as wrong, a whispering dread that knotted in my stomach. I noticed the weather had gone eerily calm, the storm clouds dissipating as the sun peeked through the trees. Shivering, I hurried back to the cabin, brushing off my encounter as a strange dream. The next morning, the sun shone bright, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as we went hiking along the scenic trails. It was there I overheard my parents casually talking about a little girl who had gone missing 2 summers ago, last seen near the lake. They said she had drowned, and with a chill, I wondered if this was the girl I had met. Later that evening, while my family played games inside, curiosity gnawed at me, and I slipped back down to the lake. The bright moon hung low in the sky, casting shimmering silvery light on the water, and I couldn't shake the feeling I was meant to be there. I called out, hoping to hear that girl's voice again, but only silence answered. Suddenly, I heard splashing, and then whispering. The whispers turned into chants as other shadows emerged from the woods. Their faces were obscured and it felt like they were both there and not there. They pointed at me, demanding I join them in their fray, but I was rooted in place, paralyzed by fear. That girl appeared again, her face twisted in anguish, as if pleading for help, and I felt an uncontrollable impulse to step forward. But as I did, an unseen force pulled me back, and I resisted. That's when I heard it, a voice from the shadows, sickly and sweet, taunting, "You could save her, but it will cost you your joy." I couldn't understand, my heart racing as I felt the shadows drawing closer. Panic surged, and for reasons I still can't fully explain, I turned and ran, bolting back towards the safety of the cabin, my mind flooded with the realization that I could never return to the lake. The following day, my family checked out a bit earlier, perhaps sensing my distress. I kept having nightmares about that girl, about the shadows lingering by the lake. Days turned into weeks, and I convinced myself it was all just a figment of my imagination, a trick of the summer blues. But then came the phone call. It was a local news report about the lake. A girl had gone missing once again. She fit the same description as the girl from my summer. My heart dropped, and guilt washed over me, the kind that feels like a lead weight dragging you down. Could I have saved her? The thought gnawed at me, but deep down, the whispers in my head urged me to let it go, telling me I was being ridiculous. Still, I couldn't shake that eerie connection, feeling as if I had witnessed something I shouldn't have. My dreams grew darker, filled with shadows and whispers, and I wouldn't let myself swim anywhere near that lake again. As summer bled into fall, I tried to put it all behind me, but one night, while scrolling through social media, I came across a post that made my blood run cold, a photograph of that girl, smiling brightly, captioned, "Missing, please help us find her." Only this time, the comments were filled with those same shadowy figures from my dreams, claiming they could help, that they knew where she was. I barely slept that night, haunted by the thought that I had left her behind. And then, without warning, the shadows came back. They invaded every corner of my mind, filling my thoughts with despair and fear until the following summer rolled around, and my parents announced we'd be heading back to the cabin. My heart raced at the thought, and despite feeling unwell, I couldn't let my parents know. I had to face whatever darkness awaited me. When we arrived, everything seemed normal, no signs of the girl, just peace and quiet, the lake shimmering under a golden sunset. I convinced myself I was imagining it all until that very first night. I went for a walk along the pier and, as soon as I stepped onto the dock, I felt it, the cold breath on my neck and the whisper of a name, urging me forward. Ignoring every logical reason, I walked to the end of the pier, and there she was, emerging from the depths of the water, her pale face shimmering under the gathering moonlight, the shadows twisting around her sorrowful eyes. "Help me," she begged, her voice echoing across the water, and I felt my resolve crumble. I stepped closer, reaching my hand out, but that's when the shadows bubbled up, swallowing her whole as their whispers turned into a deafening roar. "You should have saved her," they cried, and I finally stumbled back, horrified beyond comprehension. My body felt frozen, my breath caught in my throat, as reality shattered. I dropped to the ground, overwhelmed by a flood of sorrow as my tears cascaded like rain. Suddenly, the girl emerged from the depths again, and she cried, but this time the sound pierced deep into my soul, ripping me apart, leaving me bare. "You let me drown," she screamed, her voice merging with the shadows. I felt like I was being tossed between worlds, lost in their twisted grasp. Finally breaking free from the haze, I turned and bolted back to the cabin, knowing that I could no longer live in denial. The next morning, I gathered my courage and confessed to my parents, hoping against hope they could help me understand, but they only looked at me with concern, brushing off my tales as a youthful imagination. They didn't understand what I had witnessed or felt, nobody ever did. Days went by, each one cementing the dread that had taken root in my heart, and when the time came for us to leave, I knew with clarity, I'd be forever haunted by that girl's anguish, an echo of guilt that would never fade. I boarded the car, every thought consumed by shadows, the whispers now entwined with my own thoughts, haunting me relentlessly. "You should have saved her," they taunted, their voices familiar yet alien, sending shivers down my spine, and as we drove away, I couldn't help but look back at the lake, the last vestiges of sunlight catching its surface, that eternal stillness reflecting a million stars above, and I screamed at the top of my lungs, a desperate plea to whatever forces lingered in the dark waters, "I am so sorry." But I knew then, it would never be enough to drown out the silence that followed. I always thought my family was strange, but I never expected that the looming shadow of my father's estate would unravel everything I thought I knew about loyalty, love, and sanity. My father, still alive but battling a relentless illness that had reduced him to a mere ghost of the man he once was, owned a sprawling piece of land, a crumbling farmhouse with more history than charm, and a collection of oddities that filled every nook and cranny of the place. After years of being an outcast in my own family, my brother Alex returned with a gleam in his eye and a desperate need for money, which he insisted my father should have already divided. "He won't need it after he's gone," he told me one night as the shadows gathered in the corners of our dimly lit living room. I felt an odd chill, not from the cold, but from the look in his eyes that seemed almost predatory. He wanted me to agree to sell a portion of our father's land, a decision I found ghastly. I couldn't bear the thought of discussing finances so soon. My father was still with us, albeit slipping away by the day. "You're being selfish," Alex snapped, his voice tinged with a venom that echoed through the stillness. I could hear my father's labored breathing from the next room, a constant reminder that he was fighting his own battles, and in the throes of denial, I clung to what little was left of our family unit. The days that followed grew darker, with my brother returning at odd hours, constantly trying to charm me into seeing things his way, all the while casting angry glances at our father, as if the old man's mere existence was a blight on his plans. Conflicted, I found myself venturing into the attic to escape the familial tension, combing through dusty boxes filled with fragmented memories, discovering strange letters, some of them detailing occult practices that seemed out of place among my father's mundane possessions. Flickering candlelight from an old lantern illuminated my father's poetry, haunting verses about loss and existence, which sent chills down my spine, making me question not just Alex's motives but the very nature of what it means to own something so deeply personal. Then came the night everything changed. I woke to the sound of chanting, low and insidious, echoing through the halls of the farmhouse. In a daze, I stumbled down the creaky stairs, compelled by some unseen force to investigate. The living room was bathed in an eerie glow. Alex stood at the center, surrounded by candles casting elongated shadows that writhed against the walls like living things. His eyes were unfocused, a manic glint shimmering as he gripped a large, intricately carved pentacle that had once belonged to our father, the very emblem of what was left of our family legacy. "You don't understand what's at stake," he pleaded, a frenzy edging his voice as if he were channeling some otherworldly energy. "The estate belongs to us, but not for long if he passes. I need you to help me." Before I could respond, a low thrum reverberated from the floor beneath us, intensifying. My father's anguished groans wafted through the air, merging with the incantations that spilled from my brother's lips, forming a grotesque echo vibrating through my very bones. Paralyzed by fear, I finally found my voice, screaming at Alex to stop, but the words were lost in the hollow space as the lights flickered and the shadows convulsed. It was then that I saw it, the grotesque, distorted face of our father reflected in the window, lips moving in silent horror as if he were begging for release from the grip of his son's madness. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged for the pentacle, desperately yanking it from Alex's grasp, its edges burning against my palm. The moment I touched it, reality split apart like brittle glass. A cacophony erupted in the room, a sound that scraped the insides of my skull. I was thrown back, landing hard against the wooden floor, breath knocked from my lungs, as shadows swarmed over me with suffocating wrath, eager to consume. The last thing I remember was the sight of Alex, eyes wide with terror, unsure whether to flee or fight against the amalgamation of forces we had unleashed. When I returned to consciousness, the house felt different, heavier, charged with an anxiety I couldn't place. I scrambled to my feet, scanning the room as frail wisps of the past whispered through the air, muddled memories piercing the haze. I found my father in his bed, gasping, the lines on his face deepening as if aged by decades in just hours. Desperate to salvage what remained of my family, I pleaded with him for answers, for something to cling to that wasn't shrouded in fear. Instead, he gripped my hand with surprising strength, a grave expression washing over his features as he confessed dark family secrets, the endless cycle of greed and loss, a dreadful once-committed pact stretching back generations that led to despair, forever binding us to that estate. My brother had stumbled upon that darkness, and though he thought he could wield it, the truth was evil wasn't meant to be controlled. I raced to find Alex, but he was gone. The house echoed with madness coursing through its walls, crawling in every shadow and corner. I could feel the energy swirling around me, wrapping tighter as though the very land was rejecting me for refusing to play into its sinister game. Alone, forbidden even to call for help, I was left to confront what had transpired, the eerie weight of despair pressing down like an anchor to the abyss. My only choice was to confront the terrifying legacy of my lineage, but I wouldn't make the same mistakes. I resolved to protect my father's estate, to honor his last wishes, even if that meant facing the darkness alone, because I finally understood. Before any of it was mine, it belonged to the shadows beneath the surface, and they would only grow stronger if I followed my brother down that road. AITA for refusing to sell my father's estate and distribute the money? Maybe. But when your brother dances with devils, walking away might just be the only way to survive. Last Saturday, while the sun cast its late afternoon glow over our modest home, I received a message that would unravel everything I thought was stable in my marriage. It was from Melanie, my husband's ex-wife, and it said she needed a place to crash for a while. My fingers twitched over my phone as I hesitated, recalling the awkward dinners where I plastered a smile on my face while she recounted tales of their life together, stories punctuated with nostalgia that felt like knives twisting in my gut. I caught a glimpse of my husband, Mark, with his dreams of being a father, and I remembered how her shadow loomed over our plans, how he'd sometimes get lost in thoughts of what might have been. I took a deep breath, recalling the bite of jealousy that came with every shared memory, that smirk she wore like a crown, reminding me of her former reign over his heart. I tapped on the screen, whipped it if I told her to find another place. Just as I was about to hit send, I caught sight of Mark returning from the backyard, his hands muddy and a smile on his face, remnants of our future buried just under the surface. There was no response from the group chat, just an empty void of digital uncertainty that gnawed at me. What if they were right? What if I was the villain in this tale? As the day slipped into night, the shadows stretched, morphing and contorting into familiar shapes, weaving my mind into a frenzy of fear and anxiety. I envisioned what my decision could unleash, the ripples echoing into our lives, a thin thread snapping, leaving chaos in its wake. Mark and I sat down to dinner, his friendliness unsettling, and I found myself eating in silence, the tension growing like vines choking a tree. Did he suspect the turmoil I wove inside? My stomach churned at the thought of blurting out my plan. Afterward, as he settled into bed and the house grew quiet, I lay awake, considering every angle until I finally managed to sleep, only to be jarred awake by a crashing noise. My heart raced. I stumbled into the hallway, guided by faint whispers that danced around me. As I approached Mark's study, I saw the door ajar, and the voice that floated through sent chills down my spine. It was Melanie, hushed and conspiratorial, sweet with promises that felt laced with malevolence. I couldn't hear all the words, but the laughter set my blood on fire, and at that moment, the weight of my indecision crystallized into resolve. I would tell her to leave. That night, sleep evaded me as I envisioned the conversation brewing like a storm in the pit of my stomach. The next morning, as Mark sipped his coffee, the sun waking up through the kitchen window, I finally mustered the courage, my blood pounding in my ears. "We need to talk about Melanie," I said, my voice steady but betraying a tremor that he noticed immediately. Mark's eyes narrowed as he pushed the mug away. That was my sign. He listened as I poured out my feelings, how her presence hung over us like a specter, how it embarrassed me, how it twisted the knife deeper every time she smiled at him with that same infuriating warmth. She needs to find her own place, I concluded, my heart racing in my chest as his expression darkened. Silence enveloped the room, thick and suffocating, a pulse of tension twisting like a living thing. You don't understand how needful her situation is, he countered, his voice soft but full of brooding sadness, leaving me bewildered. How could he still defend her? My heart sank deeper as he went on about her struggles, the difficult life she had because of our divorce, and the children who lived scattered in the wake of their split. Every word he uttered felt like a sharp blade carving deeper into my resolve. I could feel tears prick at the corners of my eyes, and I choked back the helplessness clawing at my throat. But as I stared into his eyes, still sparkling with affection, I realized I couldn't let them reignite the embers of their past. The weeks dragged on, the moments we once cherished were tainted by her lingering presence. I could see it in Mark's furtive glances at his phone, the way he wore an anxious smile whenever her name popped up on the screen. It was then I decided that fear alone wouldn't determine my happiness or his instincts, it had to be gone. Our home became a battlefield of unspoken words and invisible corpses, each day a test of my will. I found myself drawn back to the messages, the ones that had painted her darker than before, a sly predator in sheep's clothing. I reached out to friends who had been sympathetic, listening intently while my confidence solidified. They told me what I had known all along. I deserved a life free from haunting pasts, a love untainted by the ghosts of former partners. It was finally time for confrontation. I had nudged the gears forward and couldn't pull back from the momentum charging through my veins. One afternoon, in the midst of kitchen chaos, I called her. My heart raced as the call connected. Her hesitant voice on the other end was a siren's call that needed shattering. "Melanie, we need to talk," I said, every word dripping with resolve, and through the exchanges, I felt the power shift in my grip. She danced around the subject, veering expertly, but I remained anchored, bringing the topic back to her stay. "Mark and I love each other, and you can't keep crashing here," I said, feeling the tremor of adrenaline coursing through my bloodstream. To my surprise, she laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that sent icy tendrils snaking down my spine. "You think this is over?" She spoke, silky and twisted. "This isn't your movie, and I'm not going anywhere." I remember that gut-sinking moment when I realized this wasn't merely about space, it was a tug-of-war for dominance. That night, I tried to shake the fear that clenched onto my gut like a vice. I envisioned slamming the door in her face, but it was Mark's words that simmered in my ears. "She's my past," he had told me, like a scar on my soul that can't simply fade. It plagued me every second until the reality set in. I had to act. Just as the sun sank low the following evening, Melanie walked in unannounced. She saw my fury and shrugged like a doll with missing strings. "Can I stay for just one more night?" she crooned, her face plastered with that same smirk that sent nausea churning in my belly. I snapped, my body fueled by primal rage. This was mine, our home. "No. You're done. You've overstayed your welcome," I shouted, my voice breaking the silence with unexpected ferocity. The calmness in her eyes vanished. For a moment, I saw something sinister flash across her face, a sharp edge, a tempest beneath the surface. "You better tread carefully, darling," she hissed, and for an instant, her hand slipped into her pocket, but I stood firm, unwavering. The tension crackled like energy in the air, enveloping us in a precarious standoff. "Get out," I repeated, cold and distant. She regarded me for a moment longer before a slow smile unfurled on her lips that set every hair on my body on edge, the kind of smile that hinted at a deeper madness, a buried threat that rose and fell with every heartbeat. "This isn't over, you know," she said, every word syrupy sweet until she finally turned to leave, and the door slammed shut with an echoing finality. I thought I had won, but as the days turned into weeks, I discovered the true cost of that victory. It wasn't until late one night, sleep evading me again, that I heard the rustling outside our window, so familiar, so haunting. I peered through the blinds, only to find her silhouette lurking across the street, her eyes alight with a dangerous glow. She stood there for hours, unmoving, and in that moment, I felt the walls of my mind closing in. It was then that I realized I hadn't simply pushed her away, I had unleashed a storm far beyond my control. Since that night, my thoughts have been increasingly fractured. Each creak in the house sends my heart racing. I see her lingering everywhere, the grocery store, the park when Mark takes our dog for a walk, even the dinner parties where friends mention her name. I can't shake the feeling that she's watching me, just waiting for the right moment to slip back into our lives like the darkness seeping through the cracks. I wish I could say that I felt free, that I had finally paved a path to happiness, but each day feels like a puzzle piece snapping into place, fraying along the edges. Was I the villain? Did I open a door I was never meant to? The echoes of laughter haunt me in the quiet hours, and as I look into Mark's eyes, I no longer see the warmth I once cherished, all I glimpse is uncertainty. I often wonder if I made a god-awful mistake, and I'm not sure if I can ever escape the shadows she left behind, or worse, if she will eventually come back for what she believes is hers. The claims of an ex haunt me now like whispers in the dark, and for the first time since we said, I do, I fear I might lose him to her still. I remember the day my friend Jay gave me the expensive clothes like it was etched into my mind, a vibrant blur of silk and stitch set against the mundane backdrop of my cluttered apartment. Jay was a fashion influencer, strutting through life like a peacock, draped in designer pieces that sparkled in the sunlight. We met in college, two misfits who bonded over weird hobbies and alternative music, and just when I thought I was past the days of scraping by, Jay surprised me with bags overflowing with items from his latest collaboration, luxury clothes that danced around their own presence with excellence. My heart swelled at the gift. I didn't just see clothes, but a ticket to a world I felt I could never belong to, a place where confidence dripped from every seam. For weeks, I wore those clothes like armor, striding through life with newfound bravado. Friends, acquaintances, even strangers complimented me, their kind words wrapping around me like a warm embrace as I reveled in the prestige those clothes brought. But as my inner circle of friends began to dwindle, whispers ran through our group. Some suggested I sell them for a quick buck, pieces like that fetched sky-high prices, they said, while others told me horror stories about friends who had borrowed expensive items and ruined them. One night, over too many cheap beers and too much bravado, I decided to post the clothes online, just to see what interest might spark, but when I woke up that morning, I felt sick at the thought. Jay had spat out warnings about the pitfalls of selling gifts, their possessions no longer, and the moment you let them go, something within you starts to wither just like that little green plant in my apartment that never thrived. The next day, Jay texted me, asking if I'd reconsider. His tone was neither accusing nor pleading, simply curious, had I really done it? I agonized, my stomach twisting like a kite caught in the wind, and the guilt clawed at me like a feral cat. I texted back, I didn't sell it, I just thought about it. His response was cool, but something flickered in the back of my mind. Was he disappointed? That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end sent a chill down my spine, a low, gravelly tone that pierced through the average daytime noise. It's important you meet me, it rasped, and something deep in my gut screamed danger. I hung up, my heart racing like a train on a crooked track, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It gnawed at me for days. Then came the confrontation over dinner, the smells of pizza and soda fading into a background haze as Jay's voice cut through the silence. You need to sell them, you're missing the opportunity here, he urged, but there was something darker behind his eyes, the flicker of something almost predatory, and as I lifted my glass, I realized that his grip on the table trembled slightly. You don't get it. I can't take something precious and just throw it away, I reasoned, but he leaned closer, and I was struck by an icy claw of fear. They don't belong to you, he hissed, his fingers curling like talons around the remnants of his slice of pizza, and I felt that inexplicable emptiness inside me flare into something jagged and immense. Later that night as I tossed and turned, my phone buzzed like a vibrant insect in the darkness. It was Jay, asking me for a photo of the clothes, seemingly innocent, but I could feel that disturbing edge underneath, coiling tighter around my mind. Caught between paranoia and friendship, I decided to ignore it, but my reluctance spiraled into an insatiable paranoia as every knock on my door echoed through my dreams. Weeks crawled by, and out of nowhere, I began receiving mysterious messages, strangers reaching out claiming to know Jay, their words slick with venom that suggested I needed to wear those clothes again or risk facing a spiritual wrath. The clothes, I learned, bore an offense only those deep in the fashion underworld could understand. They weren't mere garments, they were trophies of popularity, each thread woven from the hopes and struggles of those who desired fame before me. What had I stumbled into? I wondered, but every time I tried to confront Jay, he sidestepped me, elusive and disquietingly charming. One evening, in an effort to reclaim control, I turned on the lights in my living room and held the clothes hostage in plain sight, confronting them like they were sentient beings with an unholy agenda. I snapped a picture, half expecting to see demons lurking around the edges of the frame. Days passed in a muffled haze, but then came the night. It was stormy, the wind howling like a pack of lost souls. I sat on my couch with a glass of wine, considering burning them rather than selling them, my heart drumming with the rhythm of fear and guilt. That's when the phone rang. Eyes wide, I answered, and it was Jay again, frantic and clawing. "You want your life back. You have to wear them. If you don't, you'll never be free," he screamed through the receiver, almost incoherent. I felt tears prick at my eyes as I hung up. A tempest of panic swelled, but an insidious part of me wondered if wearing the clothes would liberate me from the shackles that had been tightening around my heart. Just that night, amid crashing thunder, I slipped into the most regal piece Jay had gifted me. Instantly, a wave of euphoria washed over, making me feel alive and powerful. The clothes wrapped around me like an embrace that transcended simple aesthetics. But as dawn approached and the light turned madly crimson, a creeping sensation clawed its way up my spine, and I caught a glimpse of myself in the old mirror. The reflection that looked back at me was distorted, twisted. It was Jay's face morphing into mine, wearing my own features in a grotesque parody. I felt the full weight of the clothes dragging me deeper into a void, and suddenly the price of acceptance became evident. The expensive threads were binding me to him. I stumbled back, ripping the clothes off as the fabric felt like razor blades against my skin, and while they landed in a heap on the floor, the moment they fell, the twisted vision vanished. Jay called for me again, begging, pleading, almost crying, and I went cold inside. I locked my door and tossed the clothes into the old furnace in my building's basement, adrenaline buzzing like a hive. Before I could feel relief, the pounding on my apartment door echoed through my mind. Jay, desperately wanting to reclaim what was his, but they weren't his anymore. "You can't throw them away. They're mine to control," he shouted, his voice breaking and unraveling into something almost pitiful. I didn't respond, just sat against the door, feeling the weight of both decisions crashing onto my shoulders. Hours crept by, and as the sun rose, I felt the tension lift as if a dark cloud had finally broken. But as I settled into that dawning tranquility, my phone buzzed with notifications, cold dread seeping back into my bones. Picture after picture poured in, Jay wearing them one by one, each snap more distorted and vengeful than the last. The final image etched a nightmare into my mind, Jay's face, grinning sickeningly as he held up a crude feedback board of my friends begging me to join them in this fashion parade, my reflection emerging from the depths of hell itself, a twisted war of dominance vibrant enough to burn the retina. At that moment, lying on my kitchen floor, I felt like I was ripped apart by threads of consequence and heartbreak. Jay wasn't just a friend anymore, he was a creature of desire, hungry for the essence that tethered me to the world I thought I understood. I was escalating into his warped image of fame, and all I could do was huddle in the corner of the room, wondering whether the price was too steep. It dawned on me then that the clothes hadn't just been a gift, they were a curse, a striking reminder that sometimes, when greed wraps its hands around your heart, it obliterates not just what you have but the familiar warmth of the person you thought you once knew. I'm writing this because I'm overwhelmed and terrified, and honestly, I don't know who to turn to because the whole thing feels surreal, like something out of a nightmare, and if I don't get it out there, I feel like I might explode. It started when I got engaged to my longtime boyfriend, Mike, and decided to have a small wedding in the woods near our favorite hike, nature-themed, simple, and intimate with just a handful of close friends and family for a lovely, rustic gathering. We were excited about everything, but when it came to the cake, we decided to go vegan since my best friend, Kylie, is vegan and had been there for me through thick and thin. We wanted everyone to enjoy it equally, without feeling pressured, and there's this small bakery that makes the most decadent vegan cakes, chocolate with raspberry filling, my absolute favorite. They assured me that the texture was just as rich as a traditional cake, and honestly, I was all in, so I ordered it and kept the choice a secret, wanting to surprise everyone. The day of the wedding arrived, and the air was crisp, filled with the sweet aroma of pine and flowers. The sound of laughter and soft music floated in the breeze as we exchanged our vows, surrounded by the natural beauty that had brought us together. The cake was everything I hoped it would be, a centerpiece topped with wildflowers, and everyone marveled at it when it was revealed, but as soon as someone took a bite, an odd heaviness fell over the gathering. The look on Uncle Barry's face was a mix of confusion and horror as he wiped remnants of cake from his mouth. A ripple of murmurs spread through the group, and before I knew it, Kylie was storming up to me with a scowl that could peel paint. Apparently, during her speech about happiness and acceptance, she inadvertently revealed the cake's vegan nature, which catapulted the guests into what felt like a modern-day witch trial. Barry, arms flailing, demanding to know why I had tricked him into eating something I hadn't labeled properly. It all spiraled out of control. Suddenly, guests were accusing me, some saying they felt disrespected by the deception, while others stood up for me, defending the choice and emphasizing taste over labels. I felt trapped in the eye of a storm, where accusations and judgments collided like thunder. I tried to explain my intentions, how I wanted to bring everyone together, but the more I spoke, the angrier they became, some claiming that it's unethical not to make dietary choices clear, which I didn't think was fair when at every event, there's bound to be someone who doesn't agree with the choices made. The tension was suffocating, and soon, guests began to leave one by one. I could see the disappointment written on my mother's face. She'd put everything into making this day special, but all I felt was shame invading my mind. I desperately sought out Mike, who was trying to calm Barry down in a corner, their voices rising with each heated word. Finally, unable to hold back anymore, I turned to Barry and said I was sorry but that he was being dramatic. That apparently triggered the lid off a boiling pot. Somehow, the conversation shifted, and not only was I under fire for the cake, but the whole wedding became a mess that solely fell on my shoulders, with even my mom chiming in with her disappointment. People began packing up the gifts, and I couldn't even process what was happening. Instead, I felt trapped in an absolute nightmare, and I began to weep while holding the remains of the cake, its beauty now marred by a strange mix of frosting and guilt. I lost track of time as people slipped away into the waning light, their murmured judgments still echoing in my head, and I could scarcely absorb the fact that my wedding day had transformed into a circus of accusations over a slice of cake. I caught snippets of conversations as the last of the guests trickled out, and someone even suggested that I should have known better than to force a cake with false marketing on them. I truly hadn't meant to upset anyone. How could a cake embody so much hostility? That night, Mike and I headed back home, his mood reflecting the dimness in my heart. He offered me a half-hearted consolation, mentioning how everyone was being overly dramatic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had somehow ruined our biggest day over something that should have brought joy. Scrolling mindlessly through my phone later, I stumbled upon posts on social media clarifying their positions on veganism as if it were a debate about morality. It tore at my heart when I discovered pictures of my wedding cake, captioned with anger, disillusion, and disbelief from guests recounting the horror of being tricked. That night, I had dreams of each guest's scornful face as they took their first bite, transformed into grotesque figures, shouting that I had robbed them of their right to true desserts. I woke up drenched in sweat, barely able to stomach breakfast, each glance in the mirror reminding me of the shame that lingered so heavy on my conscience. It's been weeks since the wedding, and things slowly returned to normal, but I haven't spoken to Kylie since. She messaged me once to say she felt embarrassed, but I didn't respond, the disappointment in her voice too much for my heart to bear. From my peripheral, I've sensed Barry lurking online, recounting the wedding misstep in forums, initiating dialogues about what it means to purposefully hide vegan options, while I sit here haunted by memories of a beautiful day turned sour over a cake. I wondered if it was worth it to stand up for my decision or if they were right, and the guilt eats me alive. So, am I the asshole for refusing to label my wedding cake as vegan? I just wanted to create a joyful memory, and instead, it feels like I've broken an invisible contract of trust over something intended to be delicious and inclusive, and I can't shake the horrible feeling that whatever small sliver of pride I had in my choice has suddenly turned into something heavy, dark, and deeply harmful.